The difference between the awareness and the mind is like the difference between the space in this room and the space outside this room. Yeah? So mind would be the space in this room, awareness would be the space outside this room, but including this space, because there's really, if you open the window and you put your hand through the open window, you don't encounter a border where you leave the space in this room and enter the space out there. It's all the same space. So in fact, this room, the space in this room is just a limitation of the only space there is in the universe. This space seems to be limited because it is enclosed by these four walls. But in fact, if you were to take a sample of this piece of space, and then you were to go outside and take a sample of that piece of space, and you were to compare them in the lab, they'd be identical. So this is the mind, the space in this room is the mind, the space out there is awareness. In other words, mind is simply a temporary and imaginary limitation of awareness. And that is why sometimes I say, see that all your experience appears in your mind. And at another time I might say, see that all your experience appears in consciousness. Now, I would make those two different statements in response to two different questions, but in exactly the same way that this chair appears both in the space of this room, it also appears in the universe. In the same way it's true to say that a thought appears in our mind. We could also say a thought appears in consciousness. Both are true depending on the context of our conversation. And then the other analogy, of course, is Mary and Jane. Mary's mind is consciousness. Mary's mind represents infinite consciousness. Jane's mind represents the finite mind. There's no such thing as Jane's mind existing independently of Mary's mind. Jane's mind is simply a limitation of Mary's mind. One more example. You draw a circle on a piece of white paper. That represents consciousness. And then you draw another circle inside that circle. Yes? That represents mind. The big circle is consciousness. And then inside the big circle there is a little circle drawn with perforated dots. If you take a sample of the white paper inside the small circle and a sample of the white paper outside the small circle but inside the big circle and compare them, they're the same. The small circle is just a limitation of the same stuff out of which the big circle is made. Okay, so choose whichever of those three analogies you like.
I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the relationship of awareness to the mind.
What is normally considered to be the mind is our internal experience, thoughts, images, memories, feelings, etc. Here, I use the term mind in a much broader context to include the totality of objective experience. Not just thinking, imagining, feeling on the inside, but also perceiving. Because perceiving is an activity of our minds. Seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling is an activity of our mind. When that activity comes to an end in deep sleep, all experience vanishes. So mind, the first thing to say about mind is that it includes all thinking, sensing, feeling, and perceiving. Now, the second thing, what is the mind, or is there something called a mind? Are there independently existing minds? I would suggest not. I would suggest that And let's take an analogy. I'm now going to contradict myself. Take your mind. Let's presume that there is something called your mind. And take the thoughts and perceptions that exist in your mind. Now, is there such a thing as an object called a thought that exists independently in your own mind? Or is a thought simply the activity of your own mind? Can you pluck a thought out of a mind and say, look, here is a thought?
No, it doesn't have an independent existence.
Or is a thought simply the experience or the activity of thinking? It is the activity of your mind.
Correct.
Okay, so a thought is not an entity in your mind. It is the activity of your mind. Yes?
Yes.
You're with me so far? Okay. Now, what I would suggest is that the relationship of a thought to each of our minds is the same relationship as exists between each of our minds and consciousness. I'll say that again because I can see a few puzzled faces. I would suggest that the relationship between a thought and each of our minds, remember, all there is to a thought is the activity of each of our minds, is the same relationship that exists between each of our minds and infinite consciousness. In other words, there is no such discrete object or entity called a mind existing in consciousness. You cannot, just as you cannot pluck a thought out of a mind, so you cannot pluck a mind out of consciousness. There is no, just as there is no thing or entity called a thought, but rather a thought is just the activity of our minds. So there is no thing or entity called a mind, but each of our minds is the activity of consciousness.
I see that. With this inherent awareness, I mean, are there any innate qualities there? In other words, are there qualities that, such as emptiness, wisdom, compassion, is that inherent in primordial awareness?
Yes, love, peace, fulfillment.
Okay, so
these are inherent, but we have to be careful saying that, because when we say love, peace, fulfillment, we are stating positive qualities of awareness, and some people legitimately object to ascribing positive qualities to something that is without qualities. But we have to remember that when we're saying love, peace and fulfillment, this is just a shorthand way of saying there is no separate. Love means there is no separation. Awareness knows no separation. Peace means awareness cannot be disturbed. Fulfillment sense means that there is no sense of lack in awareness. So really, although we use the terms love, peace and happiness, we are really saying what awareness is not. We are not ascribing positive qualities to it.
So if one were to really practice this level of awareness, that these qualities would automatically emerge.
Absolutely.
Right. That's wonderful.
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. We would find our experience in the world would be progressively saturated with love, peace, and causeless happiness. Remember, I use the word mind for the activity of awareness. That is finite experience. So it's the benefit of having two words is that we distinguish between the activity of awareness and awareness itself. The downside of having two words is that we suggest that awareness is one thing and mind is another. So let's just use the word mind, but we have to then qualify. Are we talking about, we could say mind with a capital M, which is the essence of mind or the nature of mind, or are we talking about the activity of mind, which is our changing experience? So I'm happy to use just the word mind, and it's nice just to use the word mind because it doesn't suggest any distinction between the essence of mind and the expressions of mind. But we need to make this, we need to know whether we're talking about its unlimited essence or its limited expressions.
Very nice. Thank you very much.
There is no discrete entity, no independently existing entity called a mind, but rather what we normally consider to be a mind is the activity, not an entity, but the activity of consciousness. Just as there's no such thing called a thought, but a thought is rather the activity of our mind. So our mind is itself the activity of knowing or consciousness, but is not itself a discrete, independently existing entity. I just want to be sure that that's understood.
So the metaphor or description is clear. I would love to know, how do you know this? Because I can't know it.
Okay. Is it clear to you that all there is to experience is the knowing of it?
Yes, intuitively it's completely clear. Experientially it's clear.
So intuitively and experientially, it's clear that
yes,
the only substance present in experience
is the knowing of it.
Is the knowing of it, whether you have a toothache.
But I don't know what that substance is, and that's part of the problem.
Well, okay, so when you have a toothache, that experience is just made of the knowing of it. Mm-hmm. When you have a cup of tea, that experience is just the knowing of it. Mm-hmm. When you listen to this conversation, all there is to our conversation is the knowing of it. So this single substance, knowing, or consciousness, or awareness, is modulating itself, morphing itself, as we said earlier, into all the forms of experience.
Yes.
And what I call mind is the activity of that knowing or consciousness. Yes. So mind in this approach is not an entity, it is the activity of consciousness. I want to be sure that it's clear that what we call mind, that is experience, the perception of this room, the sound of this voice, the sensation of your feet on the floor, all our activities, our relationships, that these are all thinking, sensing, perceiving, feeling, that this is the activity of consciousness, that what we call all there is to experience is mind, and all there is to mind is the activity of consciousness. Whatever is being experienced by any kind of finite mind is being experienced by the one consciousness. But the totality, there aren't finite minds that have thoughts and perceptions. There are simply 7 billion thoughts and 7 billion perceptions appearing in consciousness. There's no actual container of each thought and perception. Have you ever found a container to your thoughts and perceptions?
No.
Called my mind? No, there is no such thing called a mind. There are thoughts and perceptions in consciousness. And what you call your mind is a cluster of thoughts and perceptions. But our experience is, it becomes progressively transparent to God's presence.
So,
but we still, yes, experience it still appears in the same way. But that appearance progressively loses its veiling power.
Meaning it doesn't make us suffer anymore?
Yes. In practice, yes. Or if there are moments of suffering, they're very brief and we return. Consciousness by itself is a formless, empty, luminous presence. It has no form of its own, so there is no thought or choice or desire that is inherent in consciousness. All thought, choice, desire is a movement of consciousness, which I call mind. It is the activity of consciousness.
Okay.
So all choices, all desires, all feelings, all thoughts are mind, or the activity of consciousness. But consciousness itself, in its primal form, in its essential form, in its naked form, it has no objective qualities. There is no choice in it, no desire in it, it is empty of all objects.
So that mind and consciousness will work together.
Mind is the movement or the
Right.
activity of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
There's no question of mind and consciousness working together. Mind is the activity of consciousness. There is only one thing, if we can call it a thing, or one reality, or one entity, which is not really an entity, which is consciousness. Mind or experience is not a thing in its own right. It is simply the coloring or the activity of consciousness, which is its sole reality. There's nothing to suggest that when the physical body dies, that mind, the activity of mind, ceases. So whatever habits are present in the mind will continue. So that would be a good incentive to realizing your true nature in this life.
Very well. Well put.
I asked you a question a month or two ago on your webinar, trying to see through the illusion of seeing myself as a mind and a body. I mentioned about my dog dreaming. I don't know if you remember me, and you said, I don't know, the reason you think your dog has a mind in his body is because you think you have a mind in your body. Anyways, it was like all your pointers, they're very powerful. And I'm really glad I met you, because I feel like I'd be wandering around in non-duality forever without even considering that there's not a world made out of matter. So life has gotten really interesting for me the last few months. It just seems like there's one of two possibilities. I'm either nothing, a no thing, or I'm what I imagine myself to be most of the time. And I'm very grateful for getting the glimpses that I do get. It's exciting. The illusion, I've come to the conclusion that it's very powerful. The body is a very powerful illusion. The pain in my back, the nerve damage in my shoulder, the brushing my teeth. When I consider flipping the matter model for the consciousness model, when I'm out in nature, it's easier to consider the other possibility. Some things don't seem to fit the consciousness model as well, and specifically the fact that if this is all consciousness, how do we make things like airplanes and cars, and it just kind of blows my mind. Somehow I can't seem to get that. Sometimes those thoughts and images will pop up and it'll all collapse down on top of me. And the last thing I want to say is, you said, enjoy the journey, Scott, follow the cracks. You're giving me lots of cracks. There's no arriving. But I'd like to know, I can see that the journey never ends, but at the same point, you either believe that you're a mind in a body or you don't. I would really like to get to the point where I can see through that illusion.
Okay. But it's interesting that you ask the question the way round that you ask it. If everything is consciousness, how is it possible to make cars and aeroplanes? Why don't you? And that question comes from the deep belief that our culture has indoctrinated us with, that everything is matter. But why not ask the question the other way around? If everything is matter, how is it possible to love?
I made a list of things that make sense under the matter model and the consciousness model. I mean, a lot of things do make sense under the consciousness model.
And okay, so now you have a list of things that make sense under the matter model, and things that make sense under the consciousness-only model. And now you have to make a third list. The things that are really important to me in my life. And you have to select those things from one of your first two lists. See which list you select them from. And then whichever has the most entries, choose that model. At least give it a go. At least make the list of the things that are most important to you. See whether you select them from the matter model list or the consciousness model list. Whichever has the most entries, you experiment. You say, okay, for the duration of this week, at least for the duration of this week, you may as well do the experiment here. You've got nothing else to do. Experiment with the list that contains the elements that you consider most important in your life. Try it. Live, even if it's not your full understanding, live that possibility as if it were true, and see what response you get from the people here, from your experience. See how experience responds to your view.
Okay. I forget what's on my list. I'll have to go check.
The space of the universe is beyond the space in this room and way larger than the space of this room. And yet, at the same time, all there is to the space of this room is the space of the universe. The experience of awe is the experience of the finite mind being struck by the infinite. And it gasps as it feels the infinite within itself. Imagine if the space in this room were conscious, and add consciousness to the space in this room. Yeah, so the physical space is conscious. All its life, the space in this room has been accustomed to feeling, I am limited by these four walls. And then one day somebody opens the window, and the space in this room viscerally tastes the fact, I am the same, I am that space. And the space in this room, wow. It is struck, it is silenced, it is struck with awe. So when we feel that awe, when the mind is in a state of gratitude or awe or love, these are all examples of when the infinite striking the finite mind, or the finite mind cracking. And in that crack, it tastes its infinite reality.